Okay, welcome everybody. Today is Saturday, February 21st, 2026. My name is David Williams. I'm the Secretary of the United Federation of Phoenix, and I'd like to welcome everybody, including our special guest, Mr. Andre Bormanis, who we are interviewing. This is part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the UFP. I'll just read a little bit of your biography and
Sure,
start in with questions, if that's okay.
sure.
Mr. Bormanis is an American writer and television producer. Most recently, he worked as a writer and co-executive producer for the Disney Plus television series The Orville, created by and starring Seth MacFarlane, and also for the Peacock series The End Is Nigh, starring Bill Nye. He has also been a writer, consultant, and producer on Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, the CBS dramas Threshold and 11th Hour, ABC Studios' Legend of the Seeker, Disney's Tron Uprising, National Geographic's Mars docudrama series, and the Fox National Geographic series Cosmos. He received a Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of Arizona in 1981. He earned an MA in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from George Washington University in 1993 under a NASA Space Grant Fellowship. His thesis, focusing on NASA planetary science exploration program, was supervised by Dr. John Logsdon, who was then director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. Andre, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. So we asked our members to submit some questions. We'll sort of just go through those there. And
Okay.
you started off your career as a science consultant, right? You were a
Correct.
science consultant on TNG season seven, DS9 seasons two through seven, Voyager seasons one through seven, and for the
Hmm.
movie Star Trek Insurrection.
That's
So,
right.
what was it like to be a science consultant? What was your activities like?
When I found out that I was in contention for that job, I didn't even know that they had such a thing. I mean, I knew that in the original series, Gene Roddenberry had talked to a lot of people from like the Rand Corporation and Caltech and UCLA as he was kind of conceiving Star Trek in the mid '60s, wanting to make it as grounded in real science as possible because he wanted this to be a show that would be believable to adults and not some kind of a kid's fantasy show where anything goes, right? So I was a huge fan of the original growing up in Phoenix, where you guys are. Never thought I would have been involved working on Star Trek because, of course, long before I started really paying attention to Star Trek, it had been canceled, and I became aware of it in the '70s when I was in high school in syndication, like I'm sure a lot of you did. And then didn't think that there would ever be another Star Trek on television, let alone the movies. Well, that all happened obviously starting in the late '70s and early '80s, and I was interested in pitching stories to Star Trek The Next Generation. I'd written a spec script. They had an open submission policy back then where you could write a script, send it in, somebody would read it, and they'd tell you yes or no. A few of our best writers got their start that way, Ron Moore and Renee Echevarria, two that come to mind. So in the late '80s, I had always had an interest in writing. I loved science fiction, loved Star Trek, of course. Took some creative writing classes and had a minor in English lit when I was in college getting my physics degree because I wanted to have books to read that were not physics and math books. And I knew that I wouldn't make time for that if I didn't have a class, right? And I just love to read, I love literature. So I was watching Next Gen when it premiered in '86 or '87, whenever that was. And some of the episodes very good, some not very good. It got off to kind of a rough start, as I'm sure many of you know. And at some point, I thought, yeah, I think I could write a better story than some of these that I've seen. I wrote this spec script for Next Generation, sent it in. A couple of months later, it came back to me with a nice thanks, but no thanks from one of the producers, Maurice Hurley. But he was, encouraging. He said, "Hey, this is good. Not what we're looking for, but feel free to submit again." But I still thought, I've got some interesting story ideas for Star Trek. I wonder if there's a way I could get my foot into the door to just pitch them verbally. And Clay, my friend, said that, you really kind of need an agent to do that. Let me ask my agent if they'd be interested in representing you. And, they weren't interested. I got passed around to a lot of different people and then finally found somebody who was like, oh, we'll represent you and we'll see if we can set up a pitch meeting. Great. Well, again, they didn't really respond to any of my stories, but I found out that they were looking for a new science consultant. And again, I had no idea that they had such a thing. The guy who had been doing it, Naren Shankar, had been promoted to the writing staff. And they said, we want somebody who is, conversant in science, knows basic physics and astronomy, but also knows how to read a script, knows the show, knows how to talk to writers. And this agent I had at the time, Sal, I think he'd be perfect for this. She set up a phone call for me with Jerry Taylor, who was a supervising producer on Next Generation, I think at the time. And Jerry was terrific. We hit it off over the phone, and she invited me to come out to LA for an interview. And I had to go to a planetary science meeting in Tucson, my old stomping grounds from my U of A days. And I worked in a separate trip to LA. So I met, Jerry, Michael Piller, Brandon Braga, Ira Stephen Bear, all these people whose names I knew and, thought were terrific writers. They interviewed me, they liked me, and they hired me. And they needed me to start literally to the week that my NASA fellowship in DC ended. So in May of 1993, I moved from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles to become the science consultant on the final season of Star Trek The Next Generation, which, as Dave said, was also the second season of Deep Space Nine. So that was kind of my in. And, the first year or so of that job, I focused on doing the job that they hired me to do and making sure I did it to their satisfaction. I didn't immediately call them and say, "Hey, I've got these story ideas." That continued on Deep Space Nine and then into Voyager, which began shortly after Next Generation ended, also created by Jerry Taylor, who I had a very good friendship relationship with. It was really on Voyager that I started to get some traction pitching and then selling stories. I think I probably pitched 15 stories before they bought the first one.
That's
It's like,
awesome.
yeah, two years, 2.5 years maybe after I moved here at LA. And then a month later, they bought another one that I thought that they'd just forgotten about, but had been sitting on their back burner. And then the following season of Voyager, we were shorthanded on the writing staff. They had a story document, an outline, but they didn't have a writer on staff to do the teleplay. So Jerry called me and said, "Hey, we've got the story, but nobody here to write it. Do you want to take a crack at it?" And I'm like, "Well, sure." you know? And got the story treatment, talked to Jerry about it, went home. 2 weeks later, turned in my script, and she said, "This is really, really good." And from then on, every season I wrote either a story or a teleplay or both. And by the time Enterprise came along, Brandon Braga, who created that show with Rick Berman, said, we probably should have put you on the writing staff a long time ago, but if you want to be on the writing staff of Enterprise, um, we'd love to have you. And I said, absolutely. And my job as the science consultant was to help them with the science and technical language and the scripts, science ideas and the stories. As an example, Lisa Klink was one of our writers on Voyager. She called me one day and she said, "Hey, we're doing this episode that I came up with, involves the Voyager being sort of subjected to an experiment by these very advanced aliens who, we don't even know they exist. We don't even know they're experimenting on us. We get these clues and it's this big mystery. But I thought it would be fun if, while they're doing that to us, we're studying some spatial phenomenon. Now, obviously, we're just, our main goal is to try to get home, get back from the Delta Quadrant. What would be so interesting to Janeway, who was an astrophysicist, as you probably know, in addition to being the captain of the Voyager? I'd been reading about binary pulsars, neutron stars that orbit a common point in space. And pulsars are neutron stars that emit radio waves. And because of their rapid rotation, they're like a lighthouse, and you get these little periodic flashes. Now, if they're close enough together, at some point, they're going to collide with each other. They'll start to spiral in as they shed gravitational energy, and boom, implode into a black hole. And so I thought, well, if Janeway would come across something like this, she would stop and want to watch that from a safe distance. So Lisa said, "Oh, that sounds great. Let me know the details." And I it's the kind of thing that yes, I know that I know understand the basic idea. I could kind of figure out in broad strokes how this would work. But also, I had a list of people that I could call, scientists who were working in their fields, who had different kinds of expertise. I called a friend of mine who was a pathologist. He happened to know a guy at Caltech where he'd gone to undergraduate school, who was an astrophysicist who specialized in these things, Sri Kulkarni. So he said, "Oh, give Sri a call. I'm sure he'd be glad to help you." So Dr. Kulkarni was great, and I called him. I told him what we were doing. He said, "Oh, that sounds really cool. Let me figure out the dynamics for you." And then he worked with our VFX department, Rick Sternbach, to come up with the VFX. And probably the first time that a binary pulsar had been seen on television. Maybe there was an episode of Nova, but I don't think so because they were pretty new at the time. And it was really cool. It was a great effect, and it worked very well both in the context of the bigger story and just visually, very striking image.
Which
Yes.
episode was that of Voyager? Did
Oh,
you recall the title?
that was called. I think that was called Scientific Method.
Okay, because I remember
Scientific
that
Method.
one had
Yeah.
aliens. They were sticking devices in the crew, and
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
doing that
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah. One of the things that is noted in the Berman era Star Trek shows is, there was such a large use of what they call technobabble to
Yes.
explain things. Certainly for the engineering and science, physics for things. When I think of Voyager, I think they create a lot of interesting subatomic particles, decyons and things like that.
Yes.
Were you
Ionized
behind
L
the
beams.
were you behind the creation of any of those terms, or did that come from the writers?
Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach, who wrote the Star Trek: The Next Generation technical manual, very popular book. Some of you have probably seen it or have a copy. They came up with a lot of the terminology for the Starship Enterprise, the basic configuration of how the warp drive works, the antimatter containment pods, and how the dilithium crystals kind of moderate the matter antimatter reaction, how the transporter works by getting around the uncertainty principle in physics with something called the Heisenberg compensator. So they came up with a lot of clever stuff. And they're the ones I think who came up with the idea of a nation beam, which was, phasers or particle weapons. I think they came up with nation. I think I came up with a few others, like cause and effect, great episode of Next Generation, which was a time loop. That called for sort of inventing um, particles that had the properties we desired. And, God forbid would say, "Oh, just call it a neutron or something." And then some physicist watches that episode and say, "Oh, neutrons don't behave that way." I remember once on Next Generation, there was a planet that was suffering all these earthquakes and tsunamis. And the reason apparently was that the core of the planet was cooling and shrinking and making the crust unstable. And so Enterprise had the mission of going to this planet and somehow reheating its core. Now, when I got that story treatment, I'm like, "Hey, how are we? It's a Class M planet. It's 7 or 8 thousand miles across. The core of that planet is going to be some big blob of iron and nickel in all probability that's a few thousand miles across. There's this thing in physics called thermal inertia. So, it's very hard to change the temperature of a large mass." So I thought, well, how do we explain this? Well, we have the phasers. The phasers are particle beam weapons based on the so-called nation particle, which is a fictional particle. So I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to drill through the planet's crust. We're going to fire our phasers into the, into the, into the outer core, and the nations have the property that when they interact with certain metals in the core of this planet, it causes a chain reaction that creates more and more, you know, a cascade of particles like a nuclear pile. And I thought, well, that's, at least there's a logic there. And if you had asked somebody 100 years ago in today's world, back in, 1926. Hey, if I had a big hunk of metal the size of a refrigerator, and I threw some invisible particles into it, would you believe that a few hours later, the temperature of that big slab of metal would be raised by several hundred degrees? They'd think you were nuts. But that's how a nuclear reaction works, right? With uranium, with the uranium 235 or 238, whichever is the more fissile isotope, handful of neutrons, you know, entering the core in just the right way. They have to kind of be slowed down initially. Will split a uranium nucleus, which creates more neutrons, which split more nuclei, and on and on and on and on. And of course, when that's done in an uncontrolled way, you get a runaway nuclear reaction, which is how atomic bombs work. So I figured, well, at least there's an analogy. At least it is credible to think that there are particles that could have these kinds of impacts in a fictional setting. I didn't specify what the metals in the core might be that interacted with the nations, but at least I kind of had this little analogy to hang our techno babble on, as it were.
Yeah, I remember that episode. It was kind of fun since I was in geology grad school at ASU, bringing the crew to do
Yeah,
that. But of course, it worked because it was done by Data's mom, right? That was the episode
there
Inheritance
you
from
go.
season seven.
Yes,
So,
very good.
she
Well, the other
let him do
thing,
that.
the one thing that made me, kind of, oh no, why did they do that? They beamed data. They drilled out like a borehole, 100 miles deep or something, and it was maybe the width of my living room here. And they beamed data down to the bottom of this thing. He's literally like 100 miles deep or something in the crust of this planet. And he looks up and he sees a little spot of sky. It's like, no, that if you were in a if you were in a borehole 100 miles deep and only 20, 30 feet wide, it would be pitch black. There would be no light getting all the way down to the floor of that hole you just drilled. Other than that, I mean, that's a little bit of dramatic license, I guess. But it never occurred to me that they would do that shot. It wasn't in the script.
Yeah.
So
So as a science consultant, it sounds like you basically received scripts and read through them and then made comments on them.
yes,
Did you have to wait till you were promoted to become a writer when you were actually in the writer's room when they were breaking stories and helping that process and probably
oh
supplying some
yeah,
science content along
yeah.
the way?
That was that only happened when I started writing. I would sometimes meet with individual writers or go down to the offices and talk to them about this, that, or the other, just to kind of get a little FaceTime. But mostly, what happened is pretty much every day a courier from Paramount, and they'd bring me the day's pages, and I would go through them and read them. And if my services were needed, typically what they would do, they would put the word tech in capital letters in either the scene direction or the dialogue, and that would be my cue to fill in the blank. So I would write up suggestions. I'd sit in my little PC and go through and say, okay, and we're going to tech the tech. Okay, we're going to recalibrate the sensor array or whatever seemed appropriate for that line and what they were trying to accomplish. And then I'd write up my notes and I would fax them to the office at Paramount. This is in the days of fax machines. So I mostly worked at home.
Yeah.
And I didn't go to the lot on a regular basis until I became a staff writer on Star Trek Enterprise. Oh, by the way, talk about me feeling old. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the premiere of Enterprise this year.
That
So
we
I'm
are.
like,
Yes. Yeah.
I cannot believe that that's already here.
I think they're going to try and get most of the Enterprise cast together for Star Trek Las Vegas this summer.
Absolutely. And a lot of the writing staff too. So I'm hoping to be there.
We organize most of the Star Trek panels at our local Phoenix Comic Con called Fan
Uh-huh.
Fusion. And
Oh,
one of the
cool.
ones we're going to be doing is on Enterprise on its 25th anniversary.
Oh, awesome.
So, when you think back now to the science that was done in the Star Treks that you were around for, do you feel that there were any type of science that Star Trek did really well, or conversely, any type of science that Star Trek did pretty badly?
I think the fact that I mean, I think in terms of, really well. I mean, I think the idea of that, binary pulsar was pretty great. We did an episode on Voyager involving this idea of symbiogenesis. What other, 1 hour drama on television at that time or even today would get into such an arcane but fascinating theory in biology? So that kind of stuff, yeah, I think that's great. I think, very proud of the fact that I worked on a show that, incorporated ideas from real science that are important, cutting edge, and I think hopefully inspire people to learn more and maybe inspire people to get involved in science as a profession, engineering, medicine. We did kind of, I don't remember the episode, but I do remember not a very good episode of Voyager. And it was probably late in the season, and we were all just kind of running out of gas. And whoever wrote the episode had gotten themselves into a bit of a corner in the final act. But it's like, I have no idea. So we just said something about Janeway, like her Hail Mary was, "We're going to try an ionized L beam transmission." It's like, okay, that's utterly meaningless. And it felt like a cheat. And I still, given that this was over 25 years ago, obviously I still remember it and kind of feel bad about it. But, I did keep some things from getting into scripts that I think we would have regretted. There was a treatment for an episode of Next Generation with Captain Picard going on a holiday. And the idea was he was going to go to some Class M planet with a specially built kayak. He was going to kayak all the way down through lava tubes into the core of the planet. And I said, no, I don't think we should do this. And again, always have to be polite, respectful. I never just told a writer, certainly would never say, that's stupid and you can't do that. There were people that they interviewed for the science consultant job who had that kind of an attitude, who did not get hired. So
Yeah, it sounds like
at
it's
any
something
rate,
where you creatively say yes, find a way,
yeah,
to
well,
make it
you
happen with
just
better
you just
science.
find an alternative. I did basically just say very kind of, respectfully, yeah, I think this would be a challenging thing to justify in scientific terms. And, it's a tremendous amount of heat. I don't think structurally that you would have tubes going all the way down to the core of a planet. And I said, and it's also, this is a Jules Verne story. Do we really want to be doing Jules Verne on Star Trek? That looks a little too fanciful, I think, for our audience, right? So,
Yep, yeah, I hear you. Although I will admit there were a couple of volcanologists, Maurice and Katia Kraft, and they were
hmm.
known for using these asbestos-lined canoes to go down lava channels
Oh, wow.
in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. I think they were both killed by the eruption of Mount Unzen in the early
Oh, my
90s.
God.
But
But of
so
course, not all the way down to the core of the
no,
planet.
not all the
So,
way down the core, just on the surface there. That's dangerous enough, having been close
yeah, I
enough to
was going to say
active lava
that's,
flows. Well, let me ask you this question.
yeah.
One of our members was curious if you were ever had a situation when you were in the writer's room breaking a story and you
Hmm.
might have asked about, ships moving fast and firing weapons at each other and
Hmm.
if they're going a significant fraction of the speed of light,
Right.
are they going to with time dilation and stuff, are
Right.
they going to get hit yesterday or next week or not at all? Anything like that?
I don't think we ever had space battles per se when the ships were traveling at warp, because that just doesn't make any sense. Um, they're always at sublight. I can't think of a single example. Maybe we fired a photon torpedo or something when we were at warp, but I don't think we actually had a space battle that wasn't either in orbit of a planet or maybe out in space. But time dilation is not an issue until you get up to 95, 96% the speed of light. I mean, it doesn't kick in until you're at really, really, you know, high fraction of C. I did use time dilation. I always wanted to do this, and I had the opportunity in on the Orville, where we did an episode in season 3. We had this thing called the Aronov device, which was a way of accelerating time, which makes a certain kind of sense because time dilation, can make it possible for people to go into the future, in the sense that if you're traveling close to the speed of light, you go out a few dozen light years, turn around and come back, you will not have aged very much compared to the people you left behind on wherever you started from, right? Um, So we had this Aronov device that allowed us to get back to rescue a crew member, um, Gordon Malloy, who had been stranded in the 21st century. And unfortunately, the Aronoff device was destroyed in the process of going back in time and rescuing Gordon. So I said, Seth, this is perfect. All we have to do is fire up the engines, but don't turn on the quantum drive. We don't create the faster than light effect. We basically travel at 99% the speed of light to Alpha Tucanae, which is a star about 200 light years from the Earth. You can see it in the southern sky; it's very bright. Turn around and come all the way back to Earth, and you got to do the turnaround in order to make this time dilation effect work. And he thought, oh, that's great. So Brandon Fayette, our VFX guy, said, oh, now we got to do something different than the stars that streak by us when we see it quantum. So when they're coming toward us, they're going to be blue shifted. When they're going away from us, they're going to be red shifted. So it was kind of a cool effect, and it was a little nod to Albert Einstein and special relativity. So
Yeah, well, we're going to have some questions on the Orville absolutely at the end here.
oh, good,
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the episodes that you wrote and
sure,
that you like. I think the first one you did was in Fair Trade, which was season 3 of
yes,
Voyager.
correct,
Yeah, I remember that because that's where Voyager had reached the Necrit Expanse, and
right.
Neelix had not been beyond that,
Hmm.
and he was worried about his usefulness.
That was my first, my first teleplay assignment. And two stories, I'd sold two stories to the show before then, but neither one of them had gone into development at that point.
I think I recall Michael Piller saying, one of the things he learned from Gene Roddenberry, or maybe from his prior work, was,
Hmm.
when you approach a story development, what is it about?
Hmm.
And the focus, is has to be more on characters, not on the technology.
Yes,
And that's what
absolutely.
that's what key is makes the Star Trek episodes so interesting is how whatever the story's about affects the characters there. Um,
Absolutely.
did Jerry Taylor say the same thing when you would join the writing staff, or maybe you knew this
Oh,
already as well?
totally. No, I mean, yes, I knew that, and I'd always appreciated that aspect of good science fiction. It's really about the personal impact on one or more characters and the sort of the subtext of the story. I mean, one of my favorite original series episodes was Who Mourns for Adonais, where we meet Apollo, right? I remember watching that with my parents in rerun, and at the end of the episode, did I really ask for so much? And it's like, well, Kirk says, what you've asked is something we can no longer give. We've outgrown you. And it's very sad. And both of my parents, who were not, well, my mother could be more emotive. My dad was very sort of stoic. They were both tearing up. And I'm like, oh, and that's when I realized this is a story about children outgrowing their parents and leaving the nest and how
Hmm.
sad that is for the parent. And that's exactly what that show was about. And that's why it's so emotionally powerful. And the tech stuff was kind of cool. The idea that these Olympian gods were space travelers and developed a kind of a god complex when they discovered the simple shepherds of Earth and so forth. And Apollo just he was the last one to get over it and say, "You're right. We've lost our usefulness in effect."
I think that's the same feelings that are generated at the end of the animated series episode, How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, which had the Aztec god Kukulkan in it. Did you ever watch the
Oh,
animated series from the
I
70s?
did.
You might be too
I
old
did.
for that.
Absolutely. No, I did. I was 13 or 14 and I loved Star Trek, so I watched it. But I've seen some of them recently. Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, I don't think I've seen lately.
That was written by the late Russell Bates, who was indigenous, I think, and
Oh,
that
interesting.
I think that's the episode that won an Emmy or something like that.
Hmm. Oh,
So
that could be. Yeah.
yeah,
There was an episode of Enterprise we did. The first exoplanets were not discovered until the mid 90s, right?
correct.
And then we've also discovered these rogue planets that are untethered from any star gravitation. It probably started in a regular solar system through gravitational interactions with other planets in that forming solar system. They got kicked out, wander, wander the galaxy. And I thought it would be really cool to set a story on a rogue planet. And it's a class M planet because it has still a lot of radioactive elements in its core. And so radioactive decay is heating the planet sufficiently that it can retain an atmosphere and a reasonable temperature, even though there's no sun. And what kind of weird life might form there? Archer is beginning to question whether we really do belong out here, whether we've tried to jump out deeper into the galaxy too soon. And what are we really doing here is becoming, wasn't quite jaded, but he was starting to feel, what is the point of all of this actually? Why are we doing this? And there was this one creature who they were shapeshifters, as I recall, and intelligent. And she was able to dig into his memories, and he had an astronomy book that inspired his interest in space travel. And he'd kind of lost that childlike sense of wonder somehow. And she somehow brought it back to him and reminded him why he was out here. And he had a kind of renewed vigor about their mission after this story ended. That was like, wasn't the best story we ever did by any means, but it needed that kind of layer, right? It needed something personal.
I remember that episode, and I
Yeah.
remember that yeah, it was Archer's connection to the shape shifting alien slug lady
Yes.
that
Yeah.
made
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
nice. Let me ask you, since you were the story editor on Enterprise for all four seasons, is
Uh,
that
I started as a staff writer, then became story editor, executive story editor, and co-producer. It's a,
yeah?
it's like ranks in the military. It just means I've been around for a few years, so I get a little bump every year, a little more money, and a somewhat better sounding title.
So Enterprise was on for like four seasons,
Hmm.
and you can see how it changed. The first two were, the getting used to exploring and
Right.
meeting the Andorians and the
Right.
Tellarites, and
Yes.
then because the ratings were lower, this is what we've been told
Yeah.
is that they wanted something to really boost it in season three, and that's where you have the Xindi War arc,
Right.
that whole season long arc there.
Hmm.
And then, Manny Koto came in, right?
Yes.
And he sort of led the writing room in season four
Absolutely.
of Enterprise, where you had these mini arcs, the three and four
Yes.
season arcs that really related things back to the original series. And at least in my
Hmm.
opinion, that was the best season in these things. And you contributed to some of those things. You
Hmm.
mentioned Awakening, which was the third of
Yes.
the three-part Vulcan
Right.
Reformation thing when
Yeah.
Joanna Cassidy played T'Pol's
Yes.
mother. And can you talk a little bit about how the show in general mood changed in seasons and
Hmm.
how you all felt as you developed stories as the seasons
Right.
went by?
Yeah, absolutely. We had done 7 seasons of Next Gen, 7 seasons of Deep Space Nine, and 7 seasons of Voyager, all in the 24th century. Um, Characters, all of that era, this sort of idealized Roddenberry future where everybody basically gets along, where we're sort of enlightened humans, in the 24th century, and aren't subject to the kinds of petty arguments and things that characterize a lot of life today. It just didn't seem to make sense to do another show set in the 24th century. It's like, well, what are we going to do? Um, Obviously, Next Gen was an extension of the original series. Deep Space Nine, oh, we're going to have a show that primarily takes place on a space station. The action will come to us, like, Dodge City and Gunsmoke. Hey, great idea. Worked pretty well. Voyager, well, again, a ship of exploration, but tossed onto the other side of the galaxy by this alien phenomenon. And so that added a different dimension to, oh, we're going to see all new aliens, and we're going to be in, we're no starship can come to help us, and which was, again, really good idea. So with Enterprise, I Rick Berman and Brandon Braga decided, I think pretty early on, that they wanted to see a prequel. They wanted to see the roots, the origins of the Star Trek universe. How did we get from where we are in today's world with all of our problems and issues and troubles to this wonderful 23rd century, 24th century where, humanity is prosperous and out there exploring the stars. And we wanted it to be a little more rough and tumble. Rick and Brandon decided that, we can tell a lot of the stories that we know we want to tell that are Star Trek stories, science fiction stories exploring the galaxy, but from the perspective of people who are much more like people today. So it's kind of like imagine if all of us here in this Zoom conversation suddenly found ourselves on a starship and we could go anywhere pretty much, right? And we're going to go out and explore the galaxy. How would we react to our first, visit to a Class M planet? Well, for Kirk and Picard and Janeway, that was just another day at the office, right? To beam down to a new planet. For Archer and the crew, it's like, oh my God, it's like you get to see it through fresh eyes, through the eyes of people who are more like us, and with all of their foibles, right? And with and what behind the ears, and there was no prime directive to kind of guide them. And that I think that was a really good instinct. I think that worked really well. Where I think it could have been better is if we had embraced more of the prequel aspect sooner. We did do some of those sort of how do we get to the prime directive? What are our first interactions like with species like the Andorians? Who are the first members of the Federation, and so forth. That was kind of that was still kind of in the back burner, I think, for those first couple of seasons. And I think that we knew that we really wanted to kind of, you know, service the premise a little bit better, that we wanted to really see those formative steps on the way to what became the United Federation of Planets in the 23rd century. And Manny, yeah, Manny was a big driving force behind that. And he came aboard third season. And he was the one who really, I mean, I think everybody understood that, yeah, this isn't quite working as well as we had hoped. The fan base was fragmenting a little bit. There was a lot more science fiction on TV. It was a very different era, the early 21st century. Oh my God, it sounds like the future, doesn't it? When we started that show, and cable TV had proliferated. Um, there was original programming, there was FX, and the X Files, and there was a lot of genre fiction that competed for attention with Star Trek. And I think a lot of people, after 7 seasons of Next Gen Voyager and DS9, it's like people were looking for something different, and we tried to give them something different that was still recognizably Star Trek. But the as far as ratings go, viewership has been declining across the board for anything that is network or syndication produced television these days. And it's just it's a lot of competition out there, and younger people are watching less and less traditional television.
I presume you don't
It
watch any of the new Star Treks from the Kurtzman era.
I have watched some of them, and I watched the first episode of Starfleet Academy. I liked it. I liked the beginning of it a lot. The setup. Once they got to sort of the academy, I'm 67 years old. It's like asking a man my age to watch 90210. I'm not gonna relate to it.
Yeah,
I
I've
do
heard
like
a
it.
lot
There's
of
a lot
fans
of
say that. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
I
I'm a
like
college professor, so I've been
right.
around college age students my entire
There you
life.
go.
So,
So
I'm
you've
sort
got
of
that at
enjoying it.
least.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, and I liked a number of the Strange New Worlds episodes I've watched. I've liked. It's mostly a question of time for me.
yeah.
Just haven't had the time to really keep up with it all. I watched season 3 of Picard because it was, the getting the whole gang back together. And again, one of my friends who I worked with on Star Trek, Terry Metalis, who was Brandon's assistant for several years and then became a writer, and did 12 Monkeys and has been very successful. He was the showrunner, so I wanted to see what Terry did with the show.
What about Cosmos? What was the most fun working on
Ah,
Cosmos? That was the one with Neil deGrasse Tyson, right?
yes. Probably the most significant influence on me wanting to be not just a scientist, but also a writer was Carl Sagan, because I loved his writing and I loved the ideas that he was writing about in astronomy and physics. I was born in Chicago. We moved to Phoenix when I was 7. And that's when I could first sort of really see the stars. And not as much light pollution in Phoenix. You could actually see the Milky Way in the summer faintly from our backyard. Um, and I got interested in the sky. I learned the constellations. And then when I was in the Boy Scouts, age 11 or something, we went on a camping trip to Oak Creek Canyon. I saw the Milky Way in all its glory, which was mind blowing. And then I decided I have to buy a telescope or have my parents buy me a telescope. There was a company that made telescopes in Phoenix, and the owner of the company, Max Bray, invited me to have my dad bring me down to his shop downtown. He made little Maksutov Cassegrain telescopes, mixed mirrored lens systems, like the Questar over there. And he set this up on his sidewalk in front of the shop downtown Phoenix and pointed it at Saturn. And I looked, there's this little white disc with this little white ring, and it literally took my breath away. And I was hooked. And then I started reading Carl Sagan. I was a big fan of Ray Bradbury and Robert A. Heinlein. And so, again, like Star Trek, well, Cosmos was something I watched. I think I was already in college when that premiered and loved it. I thought it was great. Never would have imagined that there would be a remake and that I would be involved, right? And Seth MacFarlane was the one who got the new version with Neil made at Fox because he was a big fan of Cosmos, the original, and got Fox to sign off on doing it. And he'd been on Enterprise a couple of times because he was a huge Star Trek fan. I met him, when he came out and did that, and he and Brandon Braga became friends. And when Andrewian, was looking to do this new Cosmos, Seth said, "Well, let me talk to Fox." And of course, pretty much anything Seth wants to do, they'll let him do. And he was very passionate about this. And Carl had passed away, of course, at this point. They needed another astronomer, or at least somebody who knew astronomy well enough to help them with the scripts. And that's how I got involved.
Awesome
And so worked
story.
on both seasons of that. And again, it's like another full circle, weird dream come true kind of a thing. It's just crazy.
Yeah, for me too. I mean, Cosmos came on the air in 1980, so that was just about the
Right.
time I was starting high school. Having
Uh,
grown up watching the original Star Trek 5 nights a week in the 70s and early 80s,
yep.
and those
Yep.
were probably the two greatest influences on me
Yeah. Yeah.
wanting to become a planetary scientist. So
Right. Right.
that's what these programs can do. Let me ask you about the Orville since you brought up Seth
Yeah.
MacFarlane. How is the Orville different from Star Trek? And is it going to have a new season? I think is the thing we want because I know they've been talking about it.
It's you know, it is very much in the mold of Star Trek, and the reason that Seth is a huge fan of Star Trek. Obviously, he was a big Next Generation fan, and he missed that kind of storytelling on TV. Um, Episodic, high concept, moral lessons, right? Which was really not happening on TV much at that point. Science fiction had become kind of dystopian. And he started developing this before Discovery. It was around the same time, I think. But he wanted to do a show that had that kind of optimistic view of the future and that could tell interesting stories, in 50 minutes or whatever, that made people think, that that had a positive take on the future of humanity, and not the kind of dark dystopian visions that were becoming so common in science fiction, 10, 12 years ago. He wanted to be the captain of a starship, a long story short. And that's what he got to do. And so, I've met David Gerald a few times, who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles, and very, very well known science fiction writer, of course. He loves the Orville. He asked me if I could get him a little set tour, and I said, of course. So I think this was second season, He was still living in LA at the time, and he said that, when people ask me these days, and he gets asked this a lot, what is your favorite post original series Star Trek, and what is your favorite um, Star Trek movie? And David said, I always tell them my favorite Star Trek movie is Galaxy Quest, and my favorite post Star Trek series is The Orville, because they're so much truer to, the tone and the vision of the original Star Trek, because it had humor, it had pathos, there was a point to the stories, it wasn't all dark and terrible and blah blah blah. So that's how I feel about it. As far as you know, Seth says it's a matter of when, not if, there will be a season 4 of the Orville. So I would say that the likelihood of that, again, uh, Seth wants to do it, and I think that means it's going to happen. It's just a question of when. He's been busy with other projects,
So it's
and
not a money or ratings issue, it's just a timing issue,
no,
you think?
mostly a timing issue. Yeah, I think the money and the ratings and that sort of stuff. It's done well enough that it's something that could, is certainly viable in today's market, which, unfortunately is, the thing we have to think about. But it's such a different world. Star Trek, the original series, was a ratings failure. It never broke the top 50 in the 3 years that was on television, 1966 through 69. Um, but it drew 30 some odd million people a week, 30 to 40 million people, I think, a week, most weeks. That was a failure back then. I worked on this show, 11th Hour, for CBS. It was a Bruckheimer production. I think our first night out, we had 17 million viewers, and that was considered like really good, but not quite good enough. Today, if you put a show on the network and you got 17 million viewers in the traditional watching it, in real time, however, you'd be a runaway hit. And that's just not the case anymore. And again, 11th Hour, that was only 15 years ago, basically. The economics of it all is kind of baffling at this point. But there is enough interest and enough support at Disney to do another season. So it's like, he's got all these other things going on, and when the deck is cleared, he absolutely wants to go back to the Orville. We'll see if I'm still young enough to participate, should that happen. I'm not
Well, we're
put
all
out to
rooting for
pasture.
that.
Thank you.
Our club at the United Federation of Phoenix is Star Trek and general science fiction. So
Yes.
most of us here, we're fans of a wide variety of shows and movies, including
Yeah.
the Orville, and
Yes.
it's like you said, it was very, very similar to, in thought process and how
Right.
it was talking about to Star Trek, the way it was made in the Berman era. So. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We've been
Yeah.
going for about an hour here, and our club has a business meeting we have to do. But I wanted to say
Okay.
thank you so much for joining us in this conversation,
Oh,
telling
it's
us
my
about your
pleasure.
experiences,
Yeah.
and making the shows and everything like that. And if you ever travel back to Phoenix, come look us up, and you'd
I
be welcome to
will.
come to a club meeting if we're having one, or if you're out here at the time of Phoenix Fan Fusion, our local Comic Con,
Oh yeah, well
come
keep me
join us.
keep me posted on all of that, because I come back regularly. The only time I won't come back is in the summer, because I can't handle the Phoenix summers anymore. But my older brother still lives in Phoenix, and planning to go out there maybe toward the end of next month, depending on my work schedule and stuff. Still working on a few projects here that I'm trying to get going. So yeah,
Awesome.
but I'd love to come out and say hi to you guys in person.
Yeah. Okay. And that says, yeah, we'll take you out to dinner
Awesome. Yes.
if you come here.
TP
Okay.
Tap Room.